The musty smell of old paper and forgotten memories filled Margaret Chen's nostrils as she carefully lifted another cardboard box from the storage room shelf. October rain drummed steadily against the small windows of the Millbrook Historical Society, casting dancing shadows across the cluttered archive room where she spent most of her days cataloguing the town's past. At 34, Margaret had dedicated the last 8 years of her life to preserving the history of this small upstate New York community, population 3,847 according to the last census. Her meticulous nature and genuine love for historical research had earned her the respect of the elderly board members who ran the society. Though they often joked that she cared more about dead people than living ones, she couldn't argue with that assessment. The living were complicated, unpredictable, often disappointing. The dead, however, left behind fascinating stories waiting to be discovered in faded photographs, yellowed letters, and forgotten documents. The box she now examined had been donated just that morning by Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an 87-year-old widow whose late husband had served as Millbrook's postmaster for 43 years. According to the donation form, the contents dated back to the 1920s and 1930s, mostly photographs and correspondence from various community events. Margaret settled into her worn leather chair and began sorting through the contents methodically. There were pictures of harvest festivals, church gatherings, school pageants, and 4th of July parades. Each photograph told a story of a simpler time, when neighbors knew each other's names and children played safely in the streets until dark. Halfway through the box, her fingers found a particularly well-preserved photograph, larger than the others and mounted on thick cardstock. The image was remarkably clear for its age, showing 3 young boys standing beside a wooden cart loaded with boxes labeled Millbrook Cub Scout popcorn. The children appeared to be between 9 and 11 years old, wearing the characteristic brown and gold uniforms of the Boy Scouts of America's youngest division. Margaret turned the photograph over and found neat handwriting in faded blue ink. Tommy Fletcher, Billy Morrison, and friends selling popcorn for Troop 47, October 15, 1929. She smiled at the innocent scene. The boys looked so proud in their uniforms, their gap-toothed grins radiating the kind of pure joy that only children possess. The one identified as Tommy Fletcher stood in the center, slightly taller than the other two, his sandy hair neatly combed to one side. Billy Morrison, a freckled redhead, clutched a small sign that read "Fresh popcorn, 5 cents." The third boy, whose name wasn't provided, stood slightly apart from the others, his dark hair and serious expression giving him an almost haunting quality even in this cheerful moment. Margaret was about to set the photograph aside when something caught her eye. She reached for her magnifying glass, a tool she used frequently to examine fine details in historical documents. Focusing on the unnamed third boy, she studied his uniform more carefully. Her brow furrowed as she noticed details that seemed oddly familiar. The boy's neckerchief was secured with a distinctive slide featuring an eagle design, and his shirt bore patches that looked remarkably modern compared to those worn by his companions. She had seen similar uniforms before, but not from the 1920s. Rising from her chair, Margaret crossed to her reference bookshelf and pulled out her comprehensive guide to Boy Scout uniforms through the decades. She flipped to the section covering the late 1920s and compared the images to what she saw in the photograph. Tommy Fletcher and Billy Morrison wore uniforms that perfectly matched the 1929 specifications. Simple brown shirts with minimal patches, basic neckerchiefs, and the standard insignia of the era. But the third boy's uniform told a different story entirely. Margaret's hands began to tremble slightly as she cross-referenced the uniform elements with later periods. The eagle neckerchief slide, the specific patch configurations, the subtle differences in the shirt design, they all pointed to one impossible conclusion. The third boy in the 1929 photograph was wearing a Cub Scout uniform that wouldn't be introduced until 1941. She checked and double-checked her references, hoping she had made an error. But there was no mistake. The uniform design was distinctly from the early 1940s, featuring elements that simply did not exist in 1929. Margaret set down the magnifying glass and stared at the photograph with a mixture of fascination and unease. In 8 years of historical research, she had encountered plenty of mislabeled photographs and incorrect dates, but this was different. The handwriting on the back appeared authentic. The other boys' uniforms were period correct, and the overall composition of the image showed none of the telltale signs of manipulation or composite photography. Outside, the October rain intensified, and Margaret suddenly felt very alone in the archive room. She found herself studying the third boy's face more intently. Unlike his companions, who gazed directly at the camera with obvious delight, this child seemed to be looking at something just beyond the photographer's shoulder. His expression was neither happy nor sad, but rather expectant, as if he were waiting for something that had not yet arrived. A chill ran down Margaret's spine as she realized that in 1929 this boy would have been waiting for something that wouldn't exist for another 12 years. The question that now consumed her was simple yet terrifying. How could a child in 1929 be wearing a uniform from 1941? And perhaps more importantly, who was this mysterious third boy whose name had been deliberately omitted from the photograph's caption? As thunder rolled across the autumn sky, Margaret Chen had no idea that her discovery would soon lead her into the darkest chapter of Millbrook's hidden history, where the past and future collided in ways that defied all rational explanation. Margaret spent the remainder of the afternoon researching everything she could find about Millbrook's Cub Scout Troop 47 in 1929. The Historical Society's records were frustratingly sparse for that particular year, containing only basic meeting minutes and a few fundraising receipts. What she did find, however, made her discovery even more unsettling. According to the official records, Troop 47 had indeed organized a popcorn sale in October 1929, just 2 weeks before Black Tuesday would send the stock market crashing and usher in the Great Depression. The sale had been remarkably successful for such a small troop, raising nearly $40, a substantial sum for the time. But there was no mention of the participating scouts by name, and no copies of any photographs had been preserved in the official files. As the grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 5 o'clock, Margaret realized she had been so absorbed in her research that she had forgotten to eat lunch. The building was empty now except for her. Even Mrs. Patterson, the elderly volunteer who staffed the front desk, had gone home hours ago. She gathered her notes and the mysterious photograph, deciding to continue her investigation the following day. But as she prepared to leave, an idea struck her. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the woman who had donated the box, might have more information about the photograph's origins. Margaret found Mrs. Hartwell's address in the donation paperwork and decided to pay her an impromptu visit. The elderly woman lived just 6 blocks away on Maple Street, in one of the Victorian houses that gave Millbrook much of its old-world charm. The rain had subsided to a light drizzle as Margaret walked through the quiet residential neighborhood. Street lamps were beginning to flicker on, casting pools of amber light on the wet pavement. The air carried the crisp scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke from chimneys, creating an atmosphere that would have been cozy if not for the unsettling mystery occupying Margaret's thoughts. Mrs. Hartwell's house was a well-maintained 2-story Victorian painted in soft yellow with white trim. Warm light glowed from the front windows, and Margaret could see the flickering blue of a television screen in what appeared to be the living room. She climbed the front porch steps and rang the doorbell, hearing its melodic chimes echo inside the house. After a moment, she heard shuffling footsteps and the click of locks being undone. "Oh my," Mrs. Hartwell said as she opened the door, her weathered face brightening with surprise. "Miss Chen from the Historical Society. What brings you out on such a dreary evening?" "I'm sorry to bother you so late, Mrs. Hartwell," Margaret replied, "but I found something in your donation that I hoped you might be able to help me with." The elderly woman's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Please, come in out of that damp air. I was just having some tea and watching my evening programs." Mrs. Hartwell led Margaret into a cozy living room filled with antique furniture and family photographs. The house smelled pleasantly of lavender and old books, creating an atmosphere of comfort and memories. "Now then," Mrs. Hartwell said, as they settled into floral-patterned armchairs, "what did you find that has you out calling on old ladies after dark?" Margaret carefully removed the photograph from her folder and handed it to Mrs. Hartwell. "This was in your donation box. Do you remember anything about it?" The elderly woman adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles and studied the image closely. Her expression gradually shifted from curiosity to something that looked almost like recognition, followed quickly by an emotion Margaret couldn't quite identify. Was it fear? "Where exactly did you find this?" Mrs. Hartwell asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was mixed in with the other photographs from your husband's collection. According to the writing on the back, it was taken in October 1929. Mrs. Hartwell turned the photograph over and read the inscription, her lips moving silently as she processed the words. When she looked up at Margaret, her face had gone pale. "My Harold never mentioned this particular photograph to me," she said slowly, "but I remember him telling me stories about strange things that happened when he was a young man working at the post office. He started there in 1928, just 20 years old and full of ambition." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts, then continued. "Harold used to say that the autumn of 1929 was when everything changed in Millbrook. Not just because of the stock market crash, mind you, though that certainly had its impact, but something else happened that October, something that people didn't like to talk about." Margaret leaned forward, her heart rate increasing. "What kind of something?" "Children started disappearing," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Not all at once, you understand, and not in a way that attracted much attention from outside authorities. But Harold kept track of the mail routes, and he noticed when certain families stopped receiving letters addressed to their children." The room seemed to grow colder as Mrs. Hartwell spoke, and Margaret found herself glancing toward the darkened windows. "The Fletcher boy and the Morrison boy," Mrs. Hartwell continued, pointing at the photograph. "I remember Harold mentioning those names specifically. They were among the first to vanish, sometime in late October 1929. Their families received sympathy cards for weeks afterward, but Harold said the children were never found. The official story was that they had run away together, seeking adventure in the big city." "And the third boy?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. Mrs. Hartwell studied the photograph again, focusing on the unnamed child with the impossible uniform. "That's the strangest part of all," she said. "Harold swore that boy wasn't from Millbrook. He knew every family in town, every child on his postal routes. But this boy, Harold said he appeared in town just a few days before the others disappeared, and he vanished the same night they did." She handed the photograph back to Margaret with hands that trembled slightly. "There's something else, dear. Harold mentioned that in the weeks following the disappearances, people reported seeing those same 3 boys around town, always together, always in their scout uniforms, always trying to sell popcorn. But whenever someone approached them, they would simply fade away." Margaret felt a chill run through her entire body. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you saying people believed they saw ghosts?" The elderly woman nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And according to Harold, those sightings continued for decades. He claimed to have seen them himself several times over the years, always on autumn evenings, always trying to sell their popcorn, and always looking exactly the same age as they did in 1929. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending dead leaves skittering across the porch. Margaret realized that her rational, scholarly world was about to become much more complicated and much more frightening. Margaret left Mrs. Hartwell's house with more questions than answers, but armed with specific names and dates that could guide her research. The elderly woman had also provided her with a crucial piece of information. Harold Hartwell had kept detailed personal journals throughout his 43 years as postmaster, and those journals were likely stored somewhere in the Historical Society's archives. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, matching Margaret's troubled mood. She had spent most of the night lying awake, her mind racing with possibilities both logical and supernatural. The rational part of her brain insisted there had to be a reasonable explanation for the photograph's anomaly. Perhaps it was a later reproduction, or the date had been incorrectly recorded, or the uniform identification was somehow flawed. But Mrs. Hartwell's stories about disappearing children and ghostly sightings had planted seeds of doubt that logic couldn't easily uproot. Margaret arrived at the Historical Society early, before any of the volunteers or board members, and immediately headed to the basement archives. These were the oldest and least organized records, boxes and filing cabinets, filled with documents that hadn't been properly catalogued in decades. The basement always made her slightly uncomfortable. The ceiling was low, forcing her to duck occasionally around exposed pipes, and the single row of fluorescent lights created harsh shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and something else she could never quite identify, something that reminded her unpleasantly of decay. She began her search in the section marked Municipal Records 1920-1940, hoping to find Harold Hartwell's journals among the miscellaneous donations that had accumulated over the years. Most of the boxes contained predictable items: tax records, building permits, business licenses, and correspondence between town officials. It was in the 7th box she examined that Margaret found what she was looking for: a collection of leather-bound journals, each spine marked with years in Harold Hartwell's neat handwriting. She located the 1929 volume and carried it to a small table under one of the brighter lights. Harold's handwriting was precise and methodical, reflecting his background in postal work. The entries for most of 1929 dealt with routine matters, mail delivery schedules, weather conditions that affected routes, and occasional observations about the townspeople he served. But the entries beginning in mid-October told a different story entirely. October 16, 1929. Something peculiar happened today. Young Tommy Fletcher didn't collect his usual letter from his grandmother in Albany. When I asked his mother about it, she seemed confused. Said Tommy had been acting strangely for the past few days, talking about a new friend who wanted to show him and Billy Morrison something special. She seemed worried but couldn't explain why. October 18, 1929. Neither the Fletcher boy nor Billy Morrison were at school today, according to Mrs. Pemberton at the post office. She mentioned that several people saw them yesterday evening near the old Miller property at the edge of town, but they were with another boy nobody recognized. Described as thin, dark-haired, wearing a scout uniform, Mary Fletcher is beside herself with worry. October 20th, 1929. The three boys have been missing for 2 days now. Sheriff Bradley organized a search party, but they found no trace. What troubles me most is that nobody in town knows who the third boy is. I've delivered mail to every family in Millbrook for over a year, and I know every child by sight. This boy appeared from nowhere and seems to have taken our local children with him when he vanished. Margaret's hands trembled as she continued reading. Harold's entries became increasingly disturbed as the days passed. October 25th, 1929. Mary Fletcher received a sympathy card today from her sister in Buffalo, but the strange thing is, the sister's letter mentioned seeing Tommy in a dream, still wearing his scout uniform and trying to sell popcorn. How could she have known about the uniform? The disappearance hasn't been reported in any newspapers outside of Millbrook. October 30th, 1929. I saw them today. I know how this sounds, and I would not believe it myself if someone else told me such a story. But as I was finishing my evening route near Elm Street, I encountered 3 boys in scout uniforms selling popcorn from a wooden cart. It was Tommy Fletcher, Billy Morrison, and the unknown third boy, looking exactly as they did the day they disappeared. When I called out to Tommy, all 3 children turned toward me with expressions that were wrong somehow, empty. Then they simply faded away, leaving only scattered popcorn kernels on the sidewalk. Margaret set down the journal, her heart pounding. She flipped ahead, looking for more entries about the mysterious sightings. November 15th, 1929. The sightings continue. Mrs. Patterson saw them near the church last Sunday. Old Mr. Weber encountered them outside his grocery store Tuesday evening. Always the same. 3 boys, unchanged by time, trying to sell popcorn that nobody can buy. I've started carrying a camera, hoping to capture evidence, but they never appear when I'm prepared. December 3rd, 1929. I've been researching the history of the Miller property where the boys were last seen alive. The land has changed hands 6 times since 1890, and previous owners all reported strange occurrences. Children's voices in the woods, unexplained cold spots, and items moving on their own. The current owner, Mr. Miller, abandoned the property after only 2 months, claiming it was cursed by something that feeds on innocence. The entries continued sporadically throughout the years, documenting dozens of sightings by different townspeople, but what chilled Margaret to the bone was Harold's final entry about the boys, dated October 15, 1954, exactly 25 years after their disappearance. Today marks the 25th anniversary of the boys' disappearance. I've seen them consistently over the years, always unchanged, always trying to sell their popcorn, but today I noticed something new and deeply disturbing. The third boy, the one whose identity we never learned, was wearing a different uniform, not the 1929 style he wore initially, but something more modern. When I checked my Boy Scout handbook later, I realized he was wearing a uniform design that won't be introduced until next year, 1955. Whatever force keeps these children trapped between worlds, it seems to be moving them through time in ways that defy all natural law. Margaret closed the journal with shaking hands. She now had documentation spanning decades, all supporting the impossible truth suggested by the photograph, but she still needed to understand what had happened to those 3 boys, and why they remained trapped in some form of existence that allowed them to appear wearing uniforms from their future. The answer, she suspected, lay at the abandoned Miller property. And despite every instinct telling her to leave this mystery alone, Margaret Chen knew she would have to venture there to uncover the truth. As she prepared to leave the basement archives, A sound made her freeze. From somewhere in the darkness beyond her table, she heard the faint but unmistakable sound of children's laughter, followed by a voice that seemed to echo from decades past. "Fresh popcorn! Get your fresh popcorn here!" Margaret grabbed the journal and ran for the stairs, not stopping until she reached the safety of the main floor. But even there, surrounded by familiar displays and warm lighting, she could still hear the phantom voice calling out its eternal sales pitch from somewhere in the building's depths. Margaret spent the next 3 days researching everything she could find about the Miller property. Located on the outskirts of Millbrook, the 20-acre plot sat at the end of a winding dirt road that branched off from Old Mill Creek Drive. County records showed a disturbing pattern of ownership changes, with no family holding the land for more than a few years before abandoning it. The property's troubled history stretched back to 1847, when it was first settled by the Whitmore family. According to newspaper accounts from the 1850s, the Whitmores reported strange phenomena almost immediately: unexplained sounds in the night, livestock found dead without obvious cause, and their young daughter claiming to see shadow children playing in the woods. Each subsequent owner reported similar experiences, and several families lost children under mysterious circumstances. The most detailed account came from a 1923 article in the Millbrook Gazette describing the tragic case of the Brennan family. Little Sarah Brennan, age 8, was discovered missing from her bedroom on the morning of October 13th. Despite extensive searches by local authorities and volunteers, no trace of the child has been found. Mrs. Catherine Brennan reports that Sarah had been speaking for weeks about new friends who invited her to play special games in the forest. When pressed for details, Sarah would only say that the friends looked like regular children but felt cold when you touched them. Margaret found it significant that Sarah Brennan had disappeared on October 13, 1923, exactly 6 years before Tommy Fletcher and Billy Morrison vanished from the same area. The pattern was becoming clear. Every 6 years, children disappeared from or near the Miller property, always in mid-October, and always after reporting contact with mysterious playmates. Armed with this information and carrying a digital camera, flashlight, and Harold Hartwell's journal, Margaret drove out to the property on Thursday afternoon. She had told no one about her plans, partly because she didn't want to worry the Historical Society's board members, and partly because she wasn't sure anyone would believe her growing suspicions about supernatural involvement. The October sky was overcast and threatening rain as she turned onto Old Mill Creek Drive. The paved road gave way to gravel after about a mile, then to packed dirt that became increasingly rutted and overgrown. Branches scraped against her car windows, and more than once she had to stop to move fallen logs that blocked the path. The Miller property began where the road ended, marked by a rusty metal gate hanging open on broken hinges. A weathered "No Trespassing" sign hung at an angle, its paint faded and peeling. Beyond the gate, a narrow trail disappeared into dense woods that seemed unnaturally dark despite the afternoon hour. Margaret parked her car and gathered her equipment, surprised by how quiet the area was. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no wind moving through the trees. The silence felt oppressive, as if the very air were holding its breath. She followed the trail deeper into the woods, noting how the temperature seemed to drop with each step she took away from her car. The trees grew closer together here, their bare branches creating a canopy that blocked most of the remaining daylight. Her flashlight beam seemed weaker than usual, as if something were absorbing the light before it could illuminate her surroundings properly. After walking for about 15 minutes, Margaret came upon the ruins of what had once been a house. Only the foundation remained, along with a stone chimney that rose like a skeletal finger against the grey sky. Scattered around the site were remnants of domestic life, broken dishes, pieces of rusted farm equipment, and the rotted remains of wooden furniture. But it was what she found near the foundation that made her blood run cold. Arranged in a neat circle around what had once been the front porch were dozens of small objects: toy soldiers, marbles, wooden tops, jacks, and other playthings that looked decades old. At the center of the circle sat a wooden cart, similar to the one in the 1929 photograph, but weathered by years of exposure to the elements. Margaret approached the cart carefully, her camera ready. Empty popcorn boxes were stacked inside, their cardboard softened by age and moisture, but still bearing the Millbrook Cub Scout popcorn label she recognized from the photograph. The boxes showed no signs of recent disturbance, yet they appeared to have been placed there recently, certainly not decades ago. As she photographed the scene, Margaret became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere. The oppressive silence was giving way to something else, faint sounds that seemed to come from just beyond the edge of perception, children's voices, distant and hollow, as if heard through water or across a great distance. She turned slowly, scanning the woods around her, but saw nothing unusual. The voices grew slightly clearer, and she could make out words. "Come play with us. We have games to show you. Don't you want to sell popcorn?" Margaret's rational mind told her to leave immediately, but her historian's curiosity kept her rooted in place. She had to document this, had to understand what was happening here. She raised her camera and began taking photographs of the toy circle and the surrounding area. Through her camera's viewfinder, she caught a glimpse of movement near the tree line. 3 small figures, indistinct but unmistakably children, seemed to be watching her from the shadows. She lowered the camera to look with her naked eyes, but saw nothing. When she raised the camera again, the figures were closer, and she could make out more details. 3 boys in scout uniforms, their faces pale and expressionless, standing perfectly still among the trees. She recognized them immediately from the 1929 photograph: Tommy Fletcher, Billy Morrison, and the mysterious 3rd boy. Margaret's finger trembled as she pressed the shutter button, but before the camera could flash, the boys began to move. They walked toward her with an unnatural, gliding motion, their feet seeming to barely touch the ground. As they approached, she could see that their uniforms were exactly as they had appeared in the photograph, unchanged by the passage of time. "Fresh popcorn," Tommy Fletcher called out, his voice carrying an otherworldly echo. "Would you like to buy some fresh popcorn?" Margaret wanted to run but found herself frozen in place, mesmerized by the impossible sight before her. The boys stopped just a few feet away from her, and she could see that their eyes were completely black like pools of endless night. "You've been looking for us," Billy Morrison said, his child's voice distorted by something that sounded like static. "We've been waiting for you to find us." The 3rd boy, the one with the impossible uniform, stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You understand about time, don't you? How it can fold and bend and break. We've been selling popcorn for so long, waiting for someone who could see the truth." Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What happened to you? What are you?" The 3 boys exchanged glances, and for a moment their black eyes flickered with something that might have been sadness. "We made a bargain," the 3rd boy replied. "A trade, our time for eternal time, our lives for endless life, but we didn't understand the price until it was too late." As he spoke, the sky above began to darken, though it was still mid-afternoon. The temperature dropped even further, and Margaret could see her breath forming white clouds in the suddenly frigid air. "Every 6 years we're allowed to bring a new friend to play with us," Tommy Fletcher explained, with the innocent voice of a child describing a favorite game. "But you're different. You see things others can't see. You could help us find a way to stop playing and start resting." The woods around them began to fill with whispers and shadows, and Margaret realized she had stumbled into something far more dangerous and complex than a simple ghost story. These boys were trapped in some form of supernatural purgatory, and they wanted her help to escape, or to join them permanently. Margaret found herself unable to move as the 3 ghostly boys stood before her, their black eyes reflecting nothing but endless darkness. The woods had become completely silent, except for the sound of her own rapid breathing and the hammering of her heart against her ribs. "What kind of bargain?" she managed to ask, her voice barely audible in the oppressive stillness. The 3rd boy, the one whose uniform defied the laws of time, stepped closer. As he moved, Margaret noticed that the ground beneath his feet showed no impression, as if he had no physical weight at all. "There's something in these woods," he said, his young voice carrying decades of weariness, "something old and hungry that feeds on innocence and wonder. It's been here longer than the town, longer than the first settlers, maybe longer than anyone can remember." Tommy Fletcher nodded solemnly. "We came here to sell popcorn, just like we always did, but this time was different. This time, he was here." He pointed at the 3rd boy. "He said he knew a secret place where we could sell more popcorn than anyone ever had before. He said we could make enough money to help our families through the hard times coming." Margaret realized they were talking about the approaching Great Depression, still 2 weeks away from the stock market crash that would change America forever. Billy Morrison spoke up, his freckled face pale as moonlight. "We followed him deeper into the woods than we'd ever gone before. That's when we found it." "Found what?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. The 3 boys turned in unison and pointed toward an area of the woods where the trees grew so thick that her flashlight beam couldn't penetrate the darkness. "The old foundation," they said together, their voices creating an eerie harmony. "Not the house foundation you saw, the other one, much older." Margaret followed their gaze, but could see nothing beyond impenetrable blackness. "It was a trading post," the third boy explained. "Built in the 1700s by a man who made bargains with things that should never be bargained with. He promised the entity that lived here a steady supply of what it craved most, the pure energy that exists in children's souls. For nearly 2 centuries it waited," Tommy continued. "Sometimes it would take children who wandered too close. Sometimes it would send dreams to lure them in. But it was always hungry for more." Billy's voice dropped to a whisper. "When we found the old foundation, there was a man waiting for us. At least he looked like a man. He wore clothes from the old times and spoke with an accent we didn't recognize. He said he was the last descendant of the original trader, and he offered us a choice." Margaret's camera felt heavy in her hands as she realized she was documenting not just a mystery, but a confession that had been waiting nearly a century to be told. "What choice?" she asked. The third boy's black eyes seemed to grow even darker. "He said the entity needed to feed, and it would take children from Millbrook every 6 years for eternity, unless we volunteered to serve it instead. He promised that if we agreed to become its permanent servants, it would leave the other children of the town alone. We were just kids," Tommy said, his voice breaking with an emotion that transcended his ghostly state. "We thought we were being heroes. We thought we were saving everyone. But the bargain was more complex than we understood," Billy added. "We didn't just agree to die. We agreed to exist forever as bait, luring other children to feed the entity's hunger. Every 6 years, we're compelled to find a new victim to take our place, someone whose innocence can satisfy the creature for another cycle." Margaret felt sick as the full horror of their situation became clear. The children who disappeared over the years, "We brought them here," the boys confirmed in unison. "Sarah Brennan in 1923, the Walsh twins in 1935, Jenny Patterson in 1941, Michael Torres in 1947. So many others. We couldn't stop ourselves. The compulsion was too strong." The third boy stepped even closer, and Margaret could feel an unnatural cold radiating from his form. But something changed 6 years ago, in 2019. When the time came to find another victim, we tried to resist. The entity grew angry and began affecting our ability to exist in linear time. "That's why my uniform shows designs from 1941, he continued. "The creature is pulling us through different time periods as punishment for our defiance. Sometimes we appear in the past, sometimes in the future, sometimes in moments that never existed at all." Margaret's mind raced as she processed this information. "The photograph I found, it was taken in 1929, but you were wearing a 1941 uniform because time means nothing to the entity," Tommy finished. "It exists outside of normal reality, and it's dragging us with it. We're losing our connection to our own time period, becoming unstuck from when we're supposed to be." The darkness around them seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and Margaret could sense something massive and ancient stirring in response to their conversation. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "What do you want from me?" Billy Morrison looked directly into her eyes, and for a moment, his black pupils flickered with something that might have been hope. "You're the first adult who's been able to see us clearly, to understand that we're more than just ghosts or hallucinations. You study the past, you understand how time works. Maybe you can find a way to break the bargain. Or," the third boy said with frightening honesty, "maybe you can take our place. The entity is growing impatient with our resistance. It's been 6 years since we last brought it a sacrifice. If we don't provide one soon, it will begin taking children from the town again, just as it did before we made our bargain." The woods around them began to shake, and Margaret could hear something massive moving through the trees toward their location. Whatever ancient evil ruled this place was coming to meet the historian who had stumbled into its domain. "Choose quickly," the 3 boys said together, their voices now layered with harmonics that suggested something else was speaking through them. "Become the new guardian of this place, or watch as Millbrook's children begin disappearing again, one by one, until someone else takes your place." Margaret realized she had less than a minute to make a decision that would determine not only her own fate, but the safety of every child in her small town. And in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, she could hear the sound of something that had been waiting nearly 300 years for its next meal. The sound approaching through the woods was unlike anything Margaret had ever heard, a combination of rustling leaves, creaking wood, and something that might have been breathing if breath could be made of shadow and malice. The temperature around her dropped so rapidly that frost began forming on the dead leaves at her feet. "It's coming," the three boys whispered in unison, their forms beginning to flicker like old film footage. "The trader. It knows you're here." Margaret's survival instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt leaden, as if the earth itself were holding her in place. The darkness between the trees began to take shape, coalescing into something that hurt to look at directly. What emerged from the woods was tall and thin, wearing a long coat that seemed to be cut from the fabric of night itself. Its face was pale and sharp-featured, with eyes that held the cold intelligence of something far older than human civilization. When it spoke, its voice carried the authority of centuries. "Margaret Chen," it said, and hearing her name spoken by this creature sent ice through her veins. "Historian, seeker of truth. You have found more truth than you bargained for, haven't you?" The entity moved closer, and Margaret could see that its feet, like those of the boys, left no impression on the ground. But unlike the children, this being radiated a presence that made the air itself feel heavy and oppressive. "I am what your kind once called the Merchant of Sorrows," the creature continued. "I have many names in many languages, but they all mean the same thing. I trade in the currency of lost innocence. These woods have been my domain for 3 centuries, and these boys have served me faithfully for nearly 1. Margaret found her voice, though it came out hoarse and trembling. "You're the one who's been taking children. You're the reason they made the bargain." The entity's lips curved into what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth whatsoever. "I take nothing that isn't freely given, historian. The children who came to me over the centuries all made their own choices. They chose curiosity over caution, adventure over safety, the promise of wonders over the comfort of home. They were children," Margaret protested. "They couldn't understand the consequences." "Ah, but understanding is not required for a bargain to be binding," the merchant replied. "Only willingness, and children are so wonderfully willing to believe in magic, in possibilities that adults dismiss. That willingness, that pure capacity for wonder, it is the most potent force in existence." The 3 scout boys stood motionless, their black eyes reflecting the entity's dark presence. Margaret could see that they were struggling against some invisible force, trying to speak but unable to form words. "These 3 have served me well," the merchant continued, gesturing toward the boys. "For nearly a century they have brought me exactly what I required, young souls filled with innocence and imagination. The energy I harvest from such offerings sustains me for years at a time." "But 6 years ago they began to resist," Margaret said, remembering what the boys had told her. "They refused to bring you another victim." The entity's expression darkened, and the temperature dropped even further. "Yes. After decades of faithful service, they developed something I had not anticipated: regret, conscience. They began to value the lives of their potential victims more than their duty to me." Margaret watched as the 3 boys flickered more intensely, their forms becoming translucent. She realized that the entity's anger was literally causing them to fade from existence. "As punishment for their defiance," the merchant explained, "I have been pulling them through time, showing them all the moments they will never experience, all the lives they will never live. Soon, they will fade entirely, becoming nothing more than echoes of echoes." "And then what?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Then I will resume my previous methods," the creature replied with chilling matter-of-factness. "Children will begin disappearing from Millbrook again, 1 every 6 years, as it was before these boys offered themselves as substitutes, unless, of course, someone else volunteers to take their place." The entity stepped closer to Margaret, and she could feel its presence like a physical weight pressing against her mind. "You have spent your life studying the past, Margaret Chen. You understand the value of preservation, of keeping things from being lost to time. I offer you the same opportunity these boys accepted. Serve me willingly, and I will spare the children of this town." "What would that service entail?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew. "You would become my agent," the merchant explained. "Every 6 years you would identify a suitable candidate, someone whose disappearance would not be immediately noticed or widely investigated, a runaway perhaps, or a troubled child whose family has given up hope. You would lure them here, and I would do the rest." The moral horror of the proposition hit Margaret like a physical blow. She would essentially become a serial killer, albeit one serving an inhuman master for what might be considered a greater good. "And if I refuse?" she asked. The entity's smile returned, colder than before. Then these boys will fade into nothingness, and I will begin taking children at random, starting with the most innocent and imaginative I can find. Perhaps little Emma Rodriguez from Oak Street, who still believes in fairy tales, or young David Kim from the elementary school, who draws pictures of dragons and knights. Margaret's blood turned to ice. The creature knew specific children from her town, had been watching them, evaluating them as potential victims. You have studied history long enough to know that some choices define not just individual lives, but the fate of entire communities, the merchant continued. Your ancestors faced similar decisions when they first settled this land. Some chose to ignore the warnings about this place, and their children paid the price. Others made accommodations, arrangements that kept the peace. The entity extended one pale hand toward Margaret. I offer you the same choice I offered these boys in 1929. Sacrifice your own innocence to preserve that of others. Become complicit in a necessary evil to prevent a greater tragedy. Margaret looked at the three ghostly scouts who were now barely visible, their forms wavering like heat mirages. She could see in their flickering eyes a desperate plea, not for their own salvation, but for her to find some third option they had been unable to discover. As the Merchant of Sorrows waited for her answer, Margaret's mind raced through everything she had learned about this creature and its bargains. There had to be something she was missing, some detail that could provide an alternative to the horrible choice she was being offered. The fate of every child in Millbrook now rested on her ability to find a solution that nearly a century of supernatural servitude had failed to reveal. Margaret's mind raced through everything she had learned about the entity and its bargains. As a historian, she had spent years studying contracts, agreements, and legal documents from different eras. She knew that even supernatural bargains followed certain rules, certain patterns that could be analyzed and potentially exploited. You said you take nothing that isn't freely given, she said slowly, stalling for time while her thoughts crystallized. And that willingness is the only requirement for a binding bargain. The Merchant of Sorrows nodded, its pale features showing mild curiosity at her line of reasoning. Indeed, the laws that govern my existence are older than your civilization, but they are absolute. I cannot take what is not offered. But what defines willingness exactly? Margaret pressed. The boys were children when they made their bargain. In modern law, children cannot enter into binding contracts because they lack the cognitive development to fully understand the consequences of their actions. The entity's smile faltered slightly. Modern law is irrelevant here. The forces that bind my agreements predate your legal systems by millennia. Perhaps, Margaret acknowledged, but you mentioned that you've been operating under the same rules for centuries. Rules established when? And by whom? She could see the three scout boys watching her with growing hope, their flickering forms stabilizing slightly as if her questions were somehow strengthening their connection to reality. The merchant's eyes narrowed. The original compact was made with the first European settler who built upon this land, Ezekiel Blackwood, in the year 1747. He was a trader who understood the value of unusual commodities. Margaret's historian instincts kicked into high gear. So your authority to make these bargains derives from an agreement made in 1747 under colonial law, but colonial law was superseded by state law, which was superseded by federal law. If the original compact isn't valid under current legal standards— Clever, the entity interrupted, its voice carrying a dangerous edge. But you misunderstand the nature of supernatural law. It exists outside your human legal frameworks. Does it? Margaret challenged. You said yourself that you can only take what's freely given, that willingness is required. Those sound like rules, like limitations on your power. If you were truly beyond all law, you could simply take whatever you wanted. The creature began to pace, its form wavering with what might have been agitation. The cosmic forces that govern entities like myself are still forces, Margaret interrupted. Still systems with rules and boundaries. And if there are rules, there are ways to interpret those rules, to find exceptions and loopholes. She turned to address the three boys directly. When you made your bargain in 1929, did the entity explain all the terms clearly? Did it tell you that you would be trapped for decades, forced to lure other children to their deaths? Tommy Fletcher's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried clearly in the supernatural silence. No. It only told us we would serve in place of the other children. We thought that meant we would work for it somehow, not that we would die and become this. Fraud, Margaret stated firmly, turning back to face the merchant. Intentional misrepresentation of the terms of a contract. In any court of law, that would void the agreement. The entity's form began to shimmer with dark energy, and the woods around them trembled. "I am not bound by your human courts." "But you are bound by the principle of informed consent," Margaret pressed. "You admitted that willingness is required for your bargains, but true willingness requires understanding. If these boys weren't fully informed of what they were agreeing to, then their consent was invalid." The three scouts were becoming more solid, their forms gaining color and definition as Margaret's argument continued. She could see hope beginning to replace the despair in their eyes. Furthermore, Margaret continued, building momentum, the boys were minors under the care and protection of their parents and community. Any contract involving them would require parental consent, which was never obtained. The merchant's voice rose to an inhuman shriek. "I have fed on this land for 3 centuries. I will not be denied by legal technicalities." "Then prove the validity of your original compact," Margaret challenged. "Show me the documentation that gives you the right to make these bargains. Show me that Ezekiel Blackwood had the legal authority to bind future generations to your service." The entity fell silent, its form flickering between solid and translucent. For the first time since it had appeared, it seemed uncertain. Margaret pressed her advantage. "You can't show me that documentation, because it doesn't exist in any form that would hold up to legal scrutiny. Blackwood was a single individual who made a personal agreement. He had no authority to commit the entire community or future generations to your service. Moreover," she continued, her confidence growing, "even if the original compact were valid, it would have been superseded by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibited involuntary servitude. These boys have been held in supernatural slavery for nearly a century, forced to perform services against their will." The Merchant of Sorrows let out a sound that was part rage and part something like fear. "You think your mortal laws can challenge cosmic forces?" "I think," Margaret said steadily, "that even cosmic forces follow rules. And I think you've been operating under an illegal contract for nearly 300 years, taking children based on agreements that were never valid in the first place." The woods around them began to shake violently, and Margaret could hear the sound of trees crashing in the distance. But rather than feeling afraid, she felt the exhilaration of a researcher who had finally found the crucial piece of evidence that solved an impossible puzzle. "The bargain is void," she declared. "All of your bargains are void. You have no legal right to take children from this community, and you never did." The 3 scout boys suddenly became fully solid, their black eyes clearing to reveal normal human pupils. They looked at each other in amazement, then at Margaret with expressions of profound gratitude. But the Merchant of Sorrows wasn't finished fighting. With a roar that shook the very air, it began to transform into something far larger and more terrible than its human-like form had suggested. "If law will not bind you to me," it snarled with a voice like breaking stone, "then force will have to suffice." Margaret realized that while she may have won the legal argument, she still had to survive the entity's wrath long enough to escape these cursed woods. The transformation of the Merchant of Sorrows was horrifying to witness. Its pale human facade melted away like wax, revealing something that belonged to nightmares and primordial fears. The creature expanded upward, becoming a writhing mass of shadow and malice that towered above the tree line. Eyes like burning coals opened across its surface, and mouths filled with teeth appeared and disappeared in the roiling darkness of its form. 3 centuries I have fed here," the entity roared, its voice now coming from everywhere at once. "I will not be banished by a mortal's clever words." The ground beneath Margaret's feet began to crack and heave as the creature's rage manifested in physical force. Trees around the clearing snapped like twigs, and the very air seemed to thicken with supernatural energy. But something unexpected happened as the entity unleashed its fury. The 3 scout boys, now freed from their supernatural bondage, began to glow with a soft, warm light that pushed back against the surrounding darkness. "We remember now," Tommy Fletcher said, his voice filled with wonder. "We remember who we were before the bargain. We remember our families, our dreams, our hopes." "The entity kept those memories locked away," Billy Morrison added, "but now that we're free, we can feel them again, and with them, we can feel our own power." The 3rd boy, who Margaret now realized had been the entity's first victim from some earlier time period, stepped forward. "I am Samuel Whitmore," he said. "I was taken from my family in 1841, 88 years before these boys made their bargain. The creature has been using my form to lure children for nearly 2 centuries. Margaret watched in amazement as the three boys joined hands, their combined light growing brighter and more intense. "What are you doing?" she called over the howling wind that had begun to whip through the clearing. "We're doing what we should have done decades ago," Samuel replied. "We're choosing to fight instead of serve." The Merchant of Sorrows seemed to sense the threat the boys presented, because its attention shifted from Margaret to the three glowing figures. Tendrils of darkness lashed out toward them, but the light surrounding the boys deflected each attack. "You have no power over us now," Tommy shouted. "Your bargains are broken. Your hold on us is gone." The entity's form began to contract as it concentrated its energy for what Margaret sensed would be a final, devastating assault. "If I cannot have servants," it snarled, "then I will have victims." Multiple tentacles of pure shadow shot toward the boys simultaneously, moving faster than human eyes could follow. But instead of trying to dodge or defend, the three scouts did something that caught both Margaret and the entity completely off guard. They ran directly toward the creature. As they moved, their light intensified until it was almost blinding. Margaret could hear them calling out words in unison, though she couldn't make out what they were saying over the supernatural storm raging around them. The moment the boys made contact with the Merchant of Sorrows, the entire clearing erupted in brilliant white light. Margaret was thrown backward by the force of the explosion, her back striking a tree trunk hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. When her vision cleared, she found herself lying on the ground in complete silence. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by normal forest shadows, and the gentle light of late afternoon sun filtering through the trees. The supernatural cold had lifted, and she could hear birds singing in the distance. Margaret struggled to her feet, looking around frantically for any sign of the boys or the entity. The clearing where she had confronted the Merchant of Sorrows now looked like nothing more than an ordinary patch of forest. The foundation ruins were still there, but they appeared older somehow, more weathered, as if decades had passed in the span of moments. "Tommy?" she called out. "Billy? Samuel?" Her voice echoed normally through the woods, with none of the supernatural distortion she had experienced earlier. For a moment, she feared that the boys had been destroyed along with the entity, sacrificing themselves to end the curse that had held them for so long. Then she heard a familiar voice, though it sounded different now, younger, more alive. Miss Chen. She turned to see three boys emerging from behind the ruined chimney. But these weren't the ghostly figures she had been speaking with. These were living, breathing children, their scout uniforms clean and new, their faces filled with the natural color of health and life. Tommy Fletcher grinned at her with the unself-conscious joy of a 10-year-old boy. "That was amazing. Did you see how we made that monster disappear?" Billy Morrison was practically bouncing with excitement. "We're alive again. We can feel our hearts beating and everything." But it was Samuel Whitmore who provided the explanation Margaret needed. "When you broke the legal foundation of the entity's power, it could no longer maintain the supernatural bonds that held us, but the creature itself still existed and was still dangerous. We realized that the only way to truly end its threat was to use our combined life force to banish it permanently." "But you're alive," Margaret pointed out, confused. "How can you have used your life force if you're still here?" Samuel's eyes sparkled with an intelligence that seemed older than his apparent age. "That's the beautiful part. When we chose to sacrifice ourselves freely, without coercion or deception, the universe recognized our sacrifice as worthy. Instead of destroying us, our willing gift of ourselves destroyed only what was evil and corrupted, leaving our pure essence intact." Tommy nodded eagerly. "It's like we got a second chance. We're alive again, but we also remember everything that happened. All the years we spent as ghosts, all the children we couldn't save, all the guilt and sadness. But now we can do something about it." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes as the full impact of what had occurred began to sink in. "What will you do now? Your families, your time period, everything you knew is gone." The three boys exchanged glances, and she could see a wisdom in their young faces that spoke of hard-earned experience and profound purpose. "We're going to make sure nothing like this ever happens again," Billy declared. "There are other places like this, other entities that prey on children. We can sense them now, and we have the power to stop them. Besides," Samuel added with a grin that seemed to encompass both his apparent age and his true experience, "we've got all the time in the world now, and we finally know how to use it wisely." As the three boys began walking toward the path that would lead them out of the woods, Margaret realized that she had witnessed something unprecedented, a supernatural curse broken not by violence or magic, but by the application of logic, law, and the power of informed choice. The mystery of the impossible photograph had led to the liberation of 3 souls and the destruction of an ancient evil. But more importantly, it had reminded her that even in a world where the supernatural could intrude upon the natural, human reason and moral courage remained the most powerful forces for good. Margaret walked back through the woods alongside the 3 boys, marveling at how different the forest felt now that the ancient evil had been banished. Where before the trees had seemed to press in with malevolent intent, now they simply formed a natural canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. Birds sang in the branches, squirrels chattered as they gathered acorns for winter, and the air carried the clean scent of fallen leaves and earth. "Miss Chen," Tommy Fletcher said as they navigated the overgrown trail toward her car, "what are you going to tell people about what happened here? I mean, who's going to believe a story about ghosts and supernatural bargains?" It was a question Margaret had been considering herself. As a historian, she was trained to document everything, to preserve stories and evidence for future generations. But this particular story involved elements that would challenge even the most open-minded readers. "I think," she replied carefully, "that I'll focus on what can be verified and documented, the historical pattern of disappearances, the records showing families leaving the area under mysterious circumstances, the connection between the various incidents over the decades." Billy Morrison kicked at a fallen branch as they walked. "But what about us? We're supposed to be dead, aren't we? How do we explain being alive in 2025 when we disappeared in 1929? Samuel Whitmore, who had been quiet since they left the clearing, spoke up with the mature wisdom that sometimes surfaced in his young voice. "Actually, I've been thinking about that. When the entity's hold over us was broken, we weren't just returned to life, we were returned to the proper flow of time. In a sense, we're exactly where we're supposed to be." Margaret frowned, trying to understand. "What do you mean?" "Think about it," Samuel explained. "Tommy and Billy were taken in 1929 when they were 10 years old. If they had lived normal lives, they would be about 106 years old now. But their lives were interrupted, stolen from them. When they were restored, they weren't given back their original bodies from 1929. They were given new bodies at the appropriate age for the life experiences they've actually had. So we're physically 10 years old," Tommy said, grasping the concept. "But we have the memories and wisdom of people who have experienced nearly a century of existence. We're kids with old souls, literally." Margaret nodded slowly as the explanation began to make sense. "And Samuel, you said you were taken in 1841. The dark-haired boy smiled. "I should be around 194 years old if I'd lived a normal life. But like them, I've been given a body that matches my actual life experience rather than my chronological age. We're all essentially the same age in terms of what we've lived through." They reached Margaret's car as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossibly vibrant after the supernatural darkness they had experienced in the woods. Margaret unlocked her car and turned to face the 3 boys. "What happens now?" she asked. "Where will you go? You don't have birth certificates, social security numbers, any kind of official documentation that you exist." Billy grinned mischievously. "We're not exactly ordinary kids anymore, Miss Chen. I think we'll find that certain practical problems have a way of resolving themselves around us now." As if to demonstrate his point, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wallet. Inside, Margaret could see what appeared to be a perfectly legitimate driver's license, complete with Billy's photo and information listing his age as 25, which, she realized, was approximately correct for someone who had experienced what he had. Tommy and Samuel each produced similar wallets, their documents showing ages of 24 and 31 respectively. The paperwork looked completely authentic, down to the official seals and security features. "How did you—" Margaret began. "The same force that restored our lives also provided us with what we need to function in the modern world," Samuel explained. "Think of it as the universe making amends for what was taken from us." Margaret shook her head in amazement. Even after everything she had witnessed, the casual reality bending still caught her off guard. "There's something else," Tommy said, his expression becoming more serious. "We want to help you document what happened here. Not the supernatural parts necessarily, but the historical truth. The families who lost children, the patterns of disappearances, the way an entire community learned to live with an unspoken terror. Those stories deserve to be told," Billy added. "The victims deserve to be remembered even if we can't explain exactly what happened to them." Margaret felt a surge of professional excitement. "You're right. There's a complete historical narrative here that's never been properly documented. The social impact of unexplained disappearances on a small community, the way families coped with unresolved loss, the development of local folklore and cautionary tales. And, Samuel added with a meaningful look, there might be other places like this, other entities that have made similar arrangements. If we can establish a pattern, maybe we can help historians and researchers in other communities recognize the signs. The three boys climbed into Margaret's car with the casual ease of people who belonged in the modern world, despite their impossible histories. As she started the engine and began the drive back to Millbrook, Margaret realized that her life as a historian had just become infinitely more complex and important. "One more question," she said, as they drove through the gathering dusk. "The photograph that started all this, the one showing you in the 1941 uniform, Samuel, will it still exist?" Samuel considered this. "I think it will, but it might be different now. Reality has been adjusted. The photograph will probably show what actually happened in 1929 without the temporal anomaly that first caught your attention." Margaret nodded, understanding that her original piece of evidence might no longer exist in its paradoxical form, but that was acceptable. She had something far more valuable now, the living testimony of the victims themselves, and the opportunity to tell a story that had waited nearly a century to be properly told. As the lights of Millbrook came into view ahead of them, Margaret Chen knew that her work as a historian was just beginning. She had 3 extraordinary assistants now, and together they would ensure that the truth about the Miller property and other places like it would never again be allowed to remain hidden in the shadows of unexamined history. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the Miller property, Margaret sat in her office at the Historical Society, surrounded by documents, photographs, and interview transcripts that told the complete story of Millbrook's hidden tragedy. The 3 boys, though she had to remind herself they were now young men with the wisdom of decades, had proven to be invaluable research partners. Their unique perspective as both victims and witnesses of the supernatural events had provided insights no traditional historical research could have uncovered. More importantly, their presence had encouraged other long-time residents to come forward with stories they had kept secret for years. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell had been their first breakthrough. When Margaret brought the boys to meet her, the elderly woman had taken one look at Tommy Fletcher and burst into tears. "You look exactly like your mother did when she was young," she had whispered. "Mary Fletcher was my closest friend growing up. She never stopped hoping you would come home someday." Through Mrs. Hartwell, they had learned that Mary Fletcher had lived until 1987, keeping Tommy's room exactly as he had left it until the day she died. She had never remarried, never had other children, spending her life working with families of missing children and supporting search efforts throughout New York State. Billy Morrison's family story was equally heartbreaking. His parents had divorced within 2 years of his disappearance, each blaming the other for letting their son go out that October evening. His father had become an alcoholic and died young, while his mother had moved to California and changed her name, unable to bear the constant reminders of her loss. But Samuel Whitmore's story provided the most crucial historical context. As the first victim, taken in 1841, he remembered details about the entity's origins that filled in gaps in Margaret's research. "The thing that called itself the Merchant of Sorrows wasn't native to this area," he explained during one of their research sessions. "It came from somewhere else, following the European settlers as they moved west. It fed on the disruption and displacement that colonization brought, all the lost children, the broken families, the communities torn apart by rapid change." This revelation had led Margaret to contact historians in other regions, sharing her findings and asking about similar patterns of disappearances. The responses had been both fascinating and disturbing. A professor from Salem, Massachusetts, had written back about unexplained child disappearances dating back to the 1600s, always in areas where rapid development had displaced indigenous populations. A researcher in Pennsylvania had documented similar patterns along old trading routes. Most significantly, a folklore specialist from Ohio had found records of entities that matched the merchant's description in journals kept by pioneer families. "It's like a supernatural version of an invasive species," Billy had observed. "It followed human expansion, feeding on the chaos and loss that came with territorial displacement." Their research had revealed that the Miller property was just one node in a network of similar sites across the northeastern United States. Each location showed the same pattern: rapid turnover of ownership, unexplained disappearances of children, and local folklore about bargains made with mysterious entities. But the most important discovery had come when Tommy made a casual observation that changed everything. "You know what I noticed?" he had said, while reviewing a map of affected sites. "Every single location is within 5 miles of a body of water that was considered sacred by the indigenous tribes who lived there originally." Margaret had immediately begun cross-referencing their data with maps of Native American sacred sites, and the correlation was undeniable. The entities seemed to be drawn to places where the spiritual fabric had been damaged by forced displacement and cultural destruction. "It makes sense," Samuel had said when they shared this discovery. "The merchant told me once that it fed on broken dreams and severed connections. What creates more broken dreams than the destruction of entire civilizations?" This understanding had led to their most important breakthrough. Working with representatives from local tribal councils, they had learned about traditional protection rituals that could prevent entities like the Merchant of Sorrows from establishing themselves in new locations. The Oneida Nation had been particularly helpful, sharing stories about similar creatures from their oral traditions and explaining the spiritual practices that had kept such entities at bay for centuries before European contact. "The problem," explained Joseph Paulus, an Oneida elder who had agreed to work with their research team, "is that when the connection between land and people was broken by colonization, it created spiritual wounds that these parasitic entities could exploit." Margaret looked up from her notes as the 3 young men entered her office, carrying coffee and pastries from the bakery down the street. In the weeks since their return to life, they had established routines that made them seem like perfectly ordinary residents of Millbrook, despite their extraordinary circumstances. Tommy had taken a job at the local library, where his genuine love of books and uncanny ability to help researchers find exactly what they needed had made him indispensable. Billy worked part-time at the elementary school, where children were drawn to his natural warmth and seemingly infinite patience. Samuel had started teaching history at the community college, though Margaret suspected he knew more about American history than most professors with decades of experience. "Any word back from the Vermont researchers?" Billy asked, settling into one of the chairs around Margaret's conference table. "Better than that," Margaret replied with excitement. "They found 3 sites that match our profile exactly, and more importantly, they're working with the Abenaki Nation to perform protection ceremonies at all 3 locations." Samuel nodded approvingly. "Prevention is always better than cure. If we can stop these entities from establishing themselves in the first place, we won't have to deal with the aftermath decades later." "There's something else," Margaret continued. "I got a call from a documentary filmmaker in New York. She wants to do a film about our research, focusing on how historical trauma creates ongoing supernatural effects. She's particularly interested in the connection between colonization and paranormal activity." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "How much of the real story are you planning to tell?" "As much as we can while still maintaining credibility," Margaret replied. "The focus will be on the historical patterns, the social impact of unexplained disappearances, and the importance of working with indigenous communities to understand the spiritual geography of the land." "And the 3 of us?" Billy asked. Margaret smiled. "You'll be described as research consultants with unique expertise in historical trauma and its long-term effects," which is completely accurate, even if it doesn't explain how you acquired that expertise. The room fell into a comfortable silence as they contemplated how their lives had changed. 3 weeks ago, Margaret had been a solitary historian focused on cataloguing the past. Now she was part of a team working to prevent future tragedies by understanding the connection between historical injustice and ongoing supernatural threats. "You know what's interesting?" Samuel said thoughtfully. "For nearly 2 centuries I was trapped by a bargain made without full understanding of the consequences. Now I get to help prevent other people from making the same kind of uninformed choices. It's like we've become supernatural social workers," Tommy added with a grin, "helping communities heal from traumas they didn't even know they had." Margaret gathered her notes, feeling a deep satisfaction at how their work was expanding beyond simple historical documentation. They weren't just preserving the past anymore. They were actively working to create a better future. 6 months had passed since the liberation of the 3 boys, and Margaret's small office at the Millbrook Historical Society had become the unofficial headquarters of what they now called the Historical Trauma Research Network. What had started as a local investigation had grown into a collaboration involving historians, anthropologists, tribal elders, and what Tommy jokingly referred to as reformed supernatural entities from across the northeastern United States. Their network had identified 47 sites with patterns similar to the Miller property, and they had successfully performed protective ceremonies at 12 of them. More importantly, they had prevented 3 active entities from establishing themselves in new locations by working with development companies to modify construction plans and incorporate traditional spiritual protections. Margaret was reviewing correspondence from their latest collaborator, a professor from the University of Vermont who specialized in colonial-era land disputes, when her phone rang. Millbrook Historical Society, this is Margaret Chen. Miss Chen, this is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Connecticut State Police. I got your contact information from Professor Williams at Yale. We have a situation here that matches some of the patterns you've been researching. Margaret's pulse quickened. Over the past few months, they had received several calls from law enforcement agencies dealing with unexplained disappearances and strange phenomena. Most had been false alarms, tragic but entirely human crimes with no supernatural component, but a few had led to significant discoveries. What kind of situation, Detective? We have 3 children who went missing from a summer camp near Litchfield last week. The circumstances are unusual. The children were all found safe this morning, but they claim to have been approached by other children trying to sell them something called friendship tokens. The description they gave of these other children matches missing persons reports going back decades. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Detective Martinez, I need to ask you some specific questions. Was the camp located near a body of water that has historical significance to local Native American tribes? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Actually, yes. Lake Warramog. How did you know that? And have there been reports of unexplained child disappearances in that area, dating back to the early 1800s? My God, Detective Martinez whispered. You're describing exactly what we found when we started investigating the history of the area. Miss Chen, I think we need to meet in person. Margaret looked at her calendar. I can be there tomorrow with my research team. Detective, in the meantime, I need you to do something very important. Contact the Golden Hill Pawgasset Nation. They have a reservation not far from Litchfield. Tell them you need to speak with someone about spiritual protection for the Lake Warramog area. Tell them Margaret Chen from the Historical Trauma Research Network referred you. Spiritual protection? Miss Chen, I'm a police detective. I deal with facts and evidence. Detective, Margaret said gently, how long have you been investigating crimes in that area? 15 years. And in those 15 years, how many cases involving missing children have you encountered that defied conventional explanation? How many times have you had to close cases as unsolved because the evidence didn't follow normal patterns? Another long pause. More than I care to admit. Then you already know that some situations require approaches that go beyond conventional law enforcement. My team has successfully resolved several cases like this. Trust me on this one. After hanging up, Margaret immediately called Tommy, Billy, and Samuel. Within an hour, all 3 were in her office, along with Joseph Paulus, who had become their primary liaison with local tribal communities. Connecticut, Samuel said thoughtfully when Margaret had briefed them on the situation. That's outside the Merchant of Sorrow's original territory, but it fits the expansion pattern we've been tracking. Joseph nodded grimly. Lake Warramog is a sacred site for the Pawgasset people. There are stories about that area that go back centuries. Warnings about entities that feed on children's trust and innocence. So we're looking at either a copycat entity or evidence that the network is larger than we originally thought, Billy observed. There's a third possibility, Tommy added. What if destroying the Merchant of Sorrows didn't just free us? What if it sent some kind of signal to other entities, letting them know that their feeding grounds might be vulnerable? Margaret felt a chill at this possibility. You think they might be becoming more active because they sense a threat to their operations? Samuel's expression was grave. It would make sense from a survival standpoint. If they know that humans have found ways to break their bargains and destroy them, they might be trying to establish stronger holds on their territories before we can stop them. Joseph leaned forward in his chair. There's something else to consider. The protective ceremonies we've been performing, they're not just preventing new entities from moving in. They're also strengthening the spiritual fabric of the land itself. That kind of healing energy might be drawing weakened entities toward the protected areas, like parasites seeking a host. Margaret began to pace, her mind racing through the implications. So by solving one problem, we might have created another. Our success at Millbrook could be triggering increased activity elsewhere. Not necessarily, Samuel said. Remember, entities like the Merchant of Sorrows have been operating for centuries. They're opportunistic, but they're also territorial. If one territory becomes unavailable, they have to expand into new areas or compete for existing ones. Billy stood up and walked to the map on Margaret's wall, where they had marked all the identified sites with different colored pins. Look at the pattern. The sites where we've successfully performed protective ceremonies are all clustered in this region, but the new activity reports are coming from areas just outside that cluster. They're being pushed outward, Tommy realized. Like water flowing around an obstacle. Joseph nodded slowly. That's actually a good thing in the long run. It means our protections are working, but it also means we need to expand our efforts more quickly to prevent them from establishing themselves in new territories. Margaret stopped pacing and turned to face the group. Then we need to accelerate our timeline. Instead of waiting for reports of supernatural activity, we need to proactively identify vulnerable sites and protect them before entities can move in. That's going to require a much larger network, Samuel pointed out. We'll need historians, tribal liaisons, and protective ceremony specialists across multiple states. Then that's what we'll build, Margaret said firmly. This started as a local historical mystery, but it's become something much more important. We're not just documenting the past anymore. We're actively protecting communities from ongoing supernatural threats. She turned to Joseph. How quickly can you reach out to tribal nations in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and southern Massachusetts? We need to establish relationships and get permission to work in those areas. I can start making calls today, Joseph replied. But Margaret, you need to understand that this is going to change your life completely. You're talking about creating a full-time organization dedicated to supernatural threat prevention. That's a very different thing from running a small-town historical society. Margaret looked around at the three young men who had become both her research partners and her closest friends, at the map covered with pins marking sites of historical trauma and supernatural activity, at the stacks of reports documenting their growing network of collaborators. I think, she said with a smile that held both excitement and determination, that change is exactly what we need. As if to emphasize her point, the phone rang again. Margaret answered to find another detective, this time from Rhode Island, describing a situation that matched their patterns almost exactly. The network was about to grow significantly larger, and their work was about to become much more complex. But Margaret knew they were ready for the challenge. They had proven that supernatural threats could be understood, countered, and defeated through a combination of historical research, legal reasoning, and spiritual protection. Now they just had to do it on a much larger scale. 1 year after the confrontation at the Miller property, Margaret stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Massachusetts, delivering the keynote address at the first annual conference on historical trauma and supernatural phenomena. The audience included historians, anthropologists, law enforcement officials, tribal elders, and what she now thought of as experiencers, people like Tommy, Billy, and Samuel, who had direct encounters with supernatural entities and lived to tell about it. The Historical Trauma Research Network had grown beyond her wildest expectations. What had started as a collaboration between 4 people in a small-town historical society was now a formal organization with chapters in 12 states, a federal grant for research and community protection services, and recognition from both academic institutions and tribal governments as a legitimate resource for addressing supernatural threats. The key insight that transformed our approach, Margaret told her audience, was recognizing that supernatural phenomena don't exist in isolation. They emerge from and feed on historical trauma, particularly the kind of cultural and spiritual disruption caused by colonization, displacement, and the destruction of indigenous communities. In the front row, she could see Tommy, Billy, and Samuel listening with the intense focus they brought to all discussions of their work. Over the past year, they had become respected experts in their field, traveling to consultation sites across the country and helping communities understand and address supernatural threats. Tommy had completed his master's degree in library science and was now developing protocols for identifying and preserving supernatural evidence. Billy had earned certification as a child trauma counselor and specialized in helping young victims of supernatural encounters process their experiences. Samuel had been appointed as the network's director of historical research, overseeing teams of scholars who investigated patterns of supernatural activity across different time periods and geographic regions. Our success rate speaks for itself, Margaret continued. In the past year, we have successfully identified and neutralized supernatural threats at 37 locations across the northeastern United States. More importantly, We have prevented an estimated 200 children from becoming victims of entities that prey on innocence and trust. The statistics were impressive, but Margaret knew the real measure of their success wasn't in numbers. It was in stories like that of 8-year-old Maria Santos from Hartford, Connecticut, who had been approached by ghostly children trying to sell her magic stones, but had remembered the safety presentation Tommy had given at her school about stranger danger in all its forms. Or 12-year-old David Kim from Albany, the same David the Merchant of Sorrows had mentioned as a potential victim, who was now a happy 7th grader, with no idea how close he had come to a terrible fate. "But our work has also revealed something else," Margaret said, her tone becoming more serious. "The entities we've encountered are not random monsters or isolated supernatural phenomena. They represent a systematic exploitation of historical trauma, feeding on the wounds left by centuries of cultural destruction and displacement." In the audience, she could see Joseph Paulus nodding approvingly. The Oneida elder had become the network's director of tribal relations, working to ensure that their protective ceremonies were conducted with proper cultural protocol and genuine spiritual authority. "This means that our efforts to combat supernatural threats must be accompanied by broader work toward healing historical trauma," Margaret continued. "We cannot simply banish individual entities while ignoring the conditions that allow them to emerge in the first place." This insight had led to the network's most important innovation, the Community Healing Initiative. Working with tribal governments, historical societies, and local communities, they had developed a comprehensive approach that combined supernatural threat assessment with efforts to address the root causes of spiritual vulnerability. In Millbrook, for example, they had worked with the Oneida Nation to establish a memorial garden on part of the former Miller property, acknowledging the indigenous heritage of the land and honoring all the children who had been lost over the centuries. The ceremony dedicating the garden had been attended by descendants of both Native American families and European settler families, creating a moment of genuine reconciliation that seemed to heal something fundamental in the community's spiritual fabric. "The children who were taken from us are not just victims," Margaret said, looking directly at Tommy, Billy, and Samuel. "They are also our teachers. They have shown us that even the most powerful supernatural threats can be defeated through understanding, courage, and the application of moral principles that transcend the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds." After her presentation, Margaret was surrounded by conference attendees eager to discuss their own experiences with unexplained phenomena. But she found her attention drawn to a small group near the back of the auditorium, 3 middle school students who had been attending with one of the teacher participants. As she watched, Tommy approached the students and began talking with them in the easy, natural way he had with children. Margaret could see the kids' faces light up with interest and trust as he spoke, and she realized she was witnessing something beautiful and important. These children would grow up in a world where supernatural threats were acknowledged and understood, where communities had resources for protection and healing, where the kinds of tragedies that had befallen previous generations could be prevented through knowledge and preparation. Later that evening at the conference reception, Margaret found herself standing with her 3 partners on a hotel balcony overlooking the Massachusetts countryside. The fall air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves that always reminded her of that October day when she had first discovered the impossible photograph. "Can I ask you something?" she said to the 3 young men. "Do you ever regret what happened to you? I know that sounds like a strange question, but your experiences were traumatic beyond imagination. Do you ever wish things had been different?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the thoughtful seriousness he brought to everything. "I think about my original family sometimes," he said finally. "The life I might have had if I hadn't been taken in 1841. But then I think about all the children we've helped save this year, all the communities we've helped heal, and I realize that maybe this was always supposed to be my purpose." Tommy nodded agreement. "It's like we got a second chance to be heroes instead of victims. Not everyone gets that opportunity. Besides," Billy added with his characteristic grin, "how many people can say their job involves traveling around the country helping communities fight monsters? It's got to be the most interesting career path in human resources." Margaret laughed, feeling a deep warmth of affection for these extraordinary individuals who had become both her closest friends and her most trusted colleagues. "What's next?" she asked. "We've got consultation requests from California, Texas, and Florida. There are reports of similar entity networks in Europe and Australia, this work could expand indefinitely. Then we'll expand indefinitely, Samuel said simply. As long as there are children who need protection and communities that need healing, we'll be there to help. As they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the clear autumn sky, Margaret reflected on how much her life had changed since that rainy October afternoon when she had first examined a mysterious photograph. She had started as a solitary historian, focused on preserving the past, and she had become part of a team dedicated to protecting the future. The photograph that had started it all was now displayed in the Millbrook Historical Society's permanent exhibition on unexplained phenomena in local history. Visitors could see the corrected version, which showed 3 normal boys in period-appropriate uniforms selling popcorn for their scout troop in 1929, but Margaret kept a copy of the original paradoxical image in her private files, a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries begin with things that shouldn't exist. In the hotel room that night, as she prepared for sleep, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Martinez in Connecticut. 3 more sites identified, protective ceremonies scheduled for next week. Thank you for showing us that some mysteries have solutions. Margaret smiled as she set the phone aside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new communities to help, new supernatural threats to understand and neutralize. But tonight, she was content knowing that 3 boys who had been lost for nearly a century were finally home, and that their courage had created a legacy of protection that would benefit countless children for generations to come. The impossible photograph had led to an extraordinary truth. Even in a world where ancient evils could prey on innocence, human wisdom, courage, and compassion remained the most powerful forces for good. And sometimes, with the right combination of historical knowledge, legal reasoning, and spiritual protection, even the most hopeless situations could be transformed into stories of redemption and hope. Outside her window, the October night was peaceful and still, filled with the promise that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to turn mysteries into understanding, and understanding into protection for those who needed it most.